Acts chapter 18, and we will pick up where we left off in verse 12 of Acts chapter 18. You remember that Paul was in Corinth, and he is on his second missionary journey, but we're going to finish that and start the third by the time we're done tonight, I think. And here he was in Corinth, where he spent a good 18 months and had a very good ministry. And of course, the 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, all were written to the believers that were established here in this place. They were not written while he was there. He wrote letters back to them, and we have those letters. But while he was here, he did write the books of 1 and 2 Thessalonians, we know, and gave them some encouragement and some teaching that is very powerful. In fact, 1 and 2 Thessalonians are two of my favorite books in the New Testament, because they teach so much, not only about this life that we're in right now, but about what is to come in our life and the expectations that we can have. And if it wasn't for 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 especially, we wouldn't even have a strong, clear teaching about the rapture. And there's a lot of other things that supplement it, but 1 Thessalonians 4 is where it just comes down and speaks of it expressly, and you can't miss it because of that. So, coming back then into our context and into the subject at hand tonight in Acts chapter 18, let's pick up in verse 12 and see 12 through 17. First of all, as Paul goes before a fellow named Gallio. Now, you may remember last time that Claudius was the emperor, and we mentioned him because he had commanded, verse 2 says, all the Jews to leave Rome. And so a couple of those Jews, Aquila and Priscilla, who we're going to meet here later, they left, ended up, and Paul, by this divine appointment, meets Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth. And Paul is there because he was running for his life. Aquila and Priscilla were there because they were running for their life. And they end up there and becoming quite a partnership, not only in a sense a business partnership, but even more than that, a spiritual partnership that they go. So this was, we know from the dates of 41 to 54, because that's when Claudius was emperor. But when we get to verse 12, there's really this wonderful little mention that Luke gives of a fellow named Gallio. And it says that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. Now, let's just stop right there and talk about what that tells us. Of course, you remember, Luke is a doctor, but we often as well call him the historian. And the reason we call him the historian is not because he went to the university and got a degree in history and knew how to teach history, but rather he wrote history. In fact, his gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, says, I studied all this carefully, and I want to lay it out for you in consecutive order. Here's the things that we so dearly hold on to, and we don't give up a single one of these things. And he begins to write the Gospel of Luke, and then he comes to the end of the Gospel of Luke, and he really just dives into the book of Acts, if you will. In fact, you can really put Luke and Acts together as volume 1 and volume 2, and both of them are history books of a sense, and yet both of them, of course, have a very powerful theology, doctrine that's behind it as well. So Gallio, he mentions, just in a historical passing, proconsul of Achaia. We know that Achaia is a province in modern-day Greece, right? And there were two provinces, Macedonia and Achaia. Macedonia to the north, Achaia to the south. Achaia is the province where Athens was and where Corinth was. And so Gallio was in charge of this territory where Paul happened to be. And we know some about this Gallio. There's a little bit told about him in extra biblical sources. Do you know what I mean when I say extra biblical? That means it didn't come out of the Bible. That's what it means. And when we find things in extra biblical sources, sometimes there are those who just want to say, jump and say, well, I reject it then because it's from an extra biblical source. And yet, you don't reject the numbers that your calculator gives you, right? When you put 7 times 7 equals 49. That is not found in the Bible. But it's true, isn't it? So extra biblical sources you should scrutinize, but they can be very valuable. And here, for example, in this case, there are these extra biblical sources that don't do anything but verify and give insight into what we've got here in the Bible. So here's this guy Gallio. He wasn't born Gallio. He was born Marcus Novatus. Marcus Novatus. And yet his teacher was Gallio. And his teacher was in not an uncommon way, was very much an important part of his life because Gallio came from a rich family. In fact, we know that Gallio's father was Nero's tutor. He taught Nero. That's pretty important stuff, isn't it? So Gallio grew up with Nero, basically, and grew up with all of the governmental things that were around him. Where Gallio also had a teacher, Marcus Novatus had a teacher, whose name was Julius Gallio, and so many of these people actually began to take the name of their teacher, because after all, the teacher was the master, and they were called the what? Disciples, the word I was looking for. That's right. They were called the disciple. And a disciple does what? Becomes like his master. He thinks like his master, walks like his master, talks like his master. He takes on everything that is of his master. That's what a disciple does. And you and I are disciples of who? Jesus Christ. And thus we are called Christians. We take on the name of our master. And so Gallio, in a very real way, you can see how this connection of, people being called Christians, well, here's a guy that was being called Gallio because Gallio was his teacher, and he so became his teacher that he took his name. Now, Gallio, by the way, has a very famous brother named Seneca. And Seneca, it was the Roman philosopher. You can and someday I will, maybe when I'm retired or something, I'll study Seneca a little more. And, he's got lots of dramas, tragedies, poems, and he probably is the best-loved Roman philosopher of the Western world. And I think the reason is because you can actually understand what he said. And we modern Americans, we can understand what Seneca said. So we read and know Seneca. Now, I haven't know much of Seneca. You probably haven't either. But he was Gallio's brother, and we know this verifiably. And there are many who believe, actually, that Seneca later was converted by the Apostle Paul. So here's the Apostle Paul and Gallio, and then some say that it's certainly not verifiable, but some say that Seneca became a disciple of Paul. And Seneca was a Stoic. And let me tell you, one of the reasons I am a little hesitant just to accept that Seneca was a convert of Paul and even that he was a believer. That is because many of the people who came up with this idea were of the Reformed Puritan kind of faith. Well, Reformed Puritanism loved Stoicism. And Stoicism sounded so Christian to the Puritan that I wonder, and this is my hypothesis, okay? Some may have a Seneca expert here that can put me right. But my hypothesis is people who had a Stoic kind of Christian theology looked at Seneca and said, he talks like us. He must have been converted by the Apostle Paul. And they began to read all that back in there. Now, that's just a hypothesis. I'd have to figure out whether or not that's true or not. But the guy did have a famous brother anyway, and even a famous dad for that matter. And here is Gallio. So he comes. He was only proconsul of Achaia, as I mentioned, from 51 to 52. Some say 53. And just a short time, they say he left there because of his health. He needed to go someplace that wasn't right on the sea, and so he moved back to Rome. My guess is he just liked Rome better than Athens or Corinth, and so he went there. But does anyone know how Gallio died? You'll never read your Roman history. He committed suicide. And so did his brother Seneca, by the way. Both of them committed suicide. And they committed suicide, you know why? because they had to. They were punished. They were being punished, and the sentence was suicide. Go kill yourself. And that's what they did. And the crime was that they were involved, and remember, this is tied back to Gallio's dad, but they eventually were involved, or they were tried and found guilty. I don't know if they did it or not. There's some doubt. But they were tried and found guilty of a plot to overthrow Nero. And being found guilty, the sentence was, you've got to kill yourself. And that's exactly what they did, and that's exactly how they died. Now you know the rest of the story. All of that is not found in verse 12. But we do know that Gallio, that guy, was proconsul of Achaia. And it goes on in verse 2 to say, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, notice this verse 13 because I think it's important, saying, this man, Paul, persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Now that is the charge that is given to Paul by the Jews. This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Now the law, clearly, get your grammar right, the law does not say, thou shalt not worship God, right? So it isn't the worship of God that was contrary to the law. It was the manner of worshiping God that was contrary to the law. And they're saying he's telling people to worship God in a way that is not contrary to the law. And as you read this, if you just want some fun homework sometime, go pull commentaries off your shelf and see what they say about verse 13. And so many of them will say, well, Paul was actually innocent in this regard. And he wasn't teaching people to break the law. He was teaching them to be very obedient to the law. But I would completely disagree with them. The Jews were coming with this accusation. Now, consider in James, I don't know if you can put on the screen, Acts chapter 6, verse 13. But this is a charge against Peter that comes up in Acts 6:13. And in this particular charge, it says they put forward false witnesses who said, this man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law. Now, the scripture clearly tells that those witnesses that he speaks against the law, that those witnesses were what? False. So, speaking in Acts 6:13, did Peter speak incessantly against the holy place and the law? No. There were false witnesses who said he did. Now, here's how strongly you have to go with this. If Peter really was speaking against the law, then the Bible is absolutely wrong, right? Because it says they were false witnesses. And if their witness is true, then the Bible is false. So, Peter, though he was charged with it, was never speaking incessantly against the holy place, that's the temple, or the law. And you can go through Peter's writing and you see exactly that. Now, the reason, again, that Christian commentaries want to go back and say that they get all this twisted. They'll say, well, Peter really was teaching against the law. And then they'll come here and they'll say, oh, Paul really wasn't teaching against the law. It just seems like whatever the scripture comes up with, they want to flip it around and go with the opposite. Now, I think that Peter, prior to, as we can see, as we've seen here through this study, if you missed it, there's a year's worth of studies you can go through. But Peter very much was teaching according to the law prior to the time of Paul. Paul came along, and with this new revelation that he got that we've called the mystery, he was teaching against the law. And the scripture does not tell us, when we come back to Acts chapter 18, verse 13, it doesn't say these were false witnesses. Well, if Luke told us they were false witnesses in Acts 6, why doesn't he tell us they're false witnesses here? Because they're not false witnesses here. The things that Paul was teaching, for example, you can eat a ham sandwich if you want to. That is contrary to the law, isn't it? And the things that he was teaching about personal conduct, about the Sabbath. We could go through a number of things in Paul's writings about don't worry about feasts or new moons or Sabbaths and all these things. All these things, he says, that are contrary to the law. So I'm going to agree with the Jews right here. They are right when they say that Paul persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And so they bring this charge up against him. Now, I think, as I mentioned on your outline here, there's only, as a reader here, and you're trying to interpret this, there's only a couple things you can say. One, you can say, well, the Jews were wrong. They just misunderstood. They misunderstood Paul, or they misunderstood their law. That's what a lot of people say is, the Jews never understood the law right in the first place. And had they understood their own law, they would have realized that Paul just properly interpreted the law. And you can try to weave such a tale. But I think it's very difficult to validate, as I've mentioned, just because there's so many examples in which Paul teaches contrary to the law. Now, the other option you can take is that the things is just accept what the Jews said. That is, the things that Paul were teaching concerning worship were contrary to the law. And if you choose that, then here's the reason I'm camping out on this. If you choose to say the Jews are right and you don't align with the Jews, you're not ready to kill Paul, then we call you a dispensationalist. A dispensationalist recognizes that the house rules have changed. Remember that word oikonomia in Greek? Oikos is house, nomos is law, the house law. Oikonomia. Now, we say economy sometimes in a financial sense, and it's not that at all, but sometimes we'll speak about, under the economy of God. Well, the truth is there's more than one economy of God. And prior to the law being given at Mount Sinai, the people of God were able to live one way. But then all of a sudden there's a new house law, right? There's a new rule that's given. So very clearly when the law is given, cut a line. You got a new set of rules. We would call it a what? Dispensation. And I don't know why it's such a problem to come along and say the book of Acts is all telling us how we're changing from one dispensation, the dispensation of the law, to a new dispensation, the dispensation of grace, the dispensation of church. And so Paul comes here and he is being accused of teaching things that are contrary to the law. Do you know that if you teach like I teach, you will be accused of the same thing? There are all sorts of covenant theologians here that would join with the Jews here, honestly. And Seventh-day Adventists, they would certainly join with the Jews, right? Because to not worship on Sabbath on Saturday is what? Contrary to the law. And yet here I would say, no, we're free from the law in that regard. We don't have to come and live according to the Sabbath. And so here I think verse 13 is just a perfect, beautiful picture to say, look, hasn't there been a dispensational change? And if you push it honestly, I think you have to say, yeah, there certainly has been. Paul is teaching something that's different than that which has been taught before. Well, let's continue on. It says in verse 14, when Paul was shown, but when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words or names or your own law, look after it yourself. I'm unwilling to be a judge in these matters. Now, Gallio, the teacher, and Gallio, now the proconsul, the student, you see was a great, as you read the extra biblical material, he was a great student of logic and rhetoric. We have here at our church the First Classical Academy. One of the things that's important to us is to teach logic and rhetoric. And as the children grow older and our program expands, especially building upon these ideas of logic and rhetoric, this is why we started when they're young and teach them Latin, so that they can put words together and think and put all these things together, because our view is that if they know A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3, all they know is some facts. But they need to be able to comprehend the ultimate questions of life, philosophy and theology. And when you can do that, then ABC and 1, 2, 3 is useful and makes some sense, and math and astronomy and all that kind of stuff. But if all you know is math, engineering, astronomy, then all you know is math, engineering, astronomy. But think of here we're talking about Gallio. Think about Galileo. Remember him? He was the astronomer. And he, like all the astronomers in his age, or all the scientists in his age, you can take, Newton or whoever you want to, why were they doing that science? For theological reasons, philosophical reasons. And they were trying to answer the ultimate questions of life. And they weren't so concerned that the sun was, just to know that it was 250,000 miles from the earth, or however many it happens to be. It was a philosophical, theological issue. Now, Gallio was he was famous for his logic and his rhetoric, and came from a long tradition of logical thinkers. And it comes here again in verse 14, and it tells us that he shows some logic here, some reason. And had there been some logic to the request, do something about this man because he's teaching things against the law, then had it been logical for Gallio to address it, he would have. But the logic wasn't there. And so he dismissed the charge. And I think, by the way, Gallio, whatever his faith was, certainly he was not a Christian here at this point, if ever. I don't know about Seneca either. Whatever his faith was anyway, he was a principled man of government. Isn't that hard to find anymore? In other words, Gallio came and he said, I'm a government official. I take care of government business. This isn't government business. That's not mine. We live in a world today, don't we, in which everything's government business, right? How much community college costs, that's government business. Everything is government business. How much the doctor gets paid when you go and have a sinus infection, it's government business. Government. And I'm not preaching now, I'm just yakking. But we get into the same thing because sometimes, have you ever seen something that's just some heinous problem in the world or in the society or whatnot, and your gut reaction was, there ought to be a law against that? Well, that's the wrong reaction. Because if there's a law against that, that means government officials are going to get together and they're going to make a stupid law against that, and you're going to have to live with it forever. And government needs to stick to government business. And that's really what Gallio here is saying is, look, your deal of how you parse your words and your religious law, you'll go at it. That's yours to deal with. I don't know if he was a good man or a bad man, but I appreciate his response here. And the history of the American government since the Bill of Rights, anyway, has been largely favorable in this regard. And as you know, there's some of that ebbing away. But our heritage is church matters get taken care of by the church. And religious matters are not for the government to address. And Gallio really comes and says that this is the case. And for me, he would say, Gallio would say, for me to carry this out would be unreasonable. I'm not going to do it. And so going on, we pick up in verse 16, it says, and he drove them away from the judgment seat. It's a pretty strong word there, isn't it? Basically, your meeting's over. Time for y'all to get out of here and move on. So we pick up in verse 17, and it says, and they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and they began beating him in front of the judgment seat, but Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Remember that Gallio, we know from his brother, and his brother, by the way, was very appreciative of Gallio, wrote some very nice things about Gallio, said he was kind, compassionate, would give everyone an ear, and Seneca, the philosopher, remember what his philosophy was? Stoicism. And what's a Stoic say? Everything's fate, come what may, just stand there and be cool, calm, and collected. Well, he's pulling it off here, isn't he? As they're battling it out, and he is committed to this isn't my business, and he lets it happen. Call that what you want, good, bad, I don't know, but there he stands on the side. But I want to dig into this for just a moment. It says, and they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. Now, The question is, who are all these that took hold of Sosthenes? If you have a King James Bible, I don't know about the New King James here, but if you have a King James, take a look in verse 17, and you will see that it says, "Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him." So it adds that word. Now remember, all the new translations are built upon a different underlying text, and there are some differences, and so you need to compare here. And I default to the text that's underlying the King James. So let's put in the word Greeks here. It's translated Greeks. That is a word that can go either way because it's the word that we get Hellenist, and a Hellenist is someone with Grecian thinking, right? They have Greek philosophy, a Greek way of thinking. We might say, if it were the modern world, we would say, well, he thinks as a Westerner. There's Western thinking and there's Eastern thinking. And that Hellenist idea is Western thinking. And as you come as a translator here, you don't really know, are we talking actual Greek people, or are we talking, anyone from anywhere, but they think in a Hellenistic way? Because as you remember from Acts chapter 6, remember the particular widows that were not being cared for? And those widows were what? Hellenistic Jews. And you could translate that Greek Jews, but you'd probably be wrong. My guess is those Jewish widows had never left Israel. They're born in Israel, raised in Israel, in Jerusalem itself, and yet Jerusalem itself had been overcome by the Greeks back, in the 200 BCs. So lots of Greek influence, and some of them had bought into it. Now, I happen to think here that when we come to verse 17, they here is Hellenistic Jews. Hellenistic Jews, because I don't know why. I think the non-Jewish Greeks are going to be like Gallio. They're just going to stand back and watch the fight. They might put some money on Sosthenes or on this guy. I don't know. I might make a little game out of it. But what's it to them? There's no motive here. But for those in the synagogue, we've gone up now and just got egg on our face right before the proconsul, and he's driven us out of here. And all I can do is read into this to try to figure out what happened. But Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, is beaten. Well, maybe Sosthenes is the guy who says, hey guys, let's take this Paul to the governor and to the proconsul. Let's get him charged. And maybe the Hellenistic Jews are saying, Sosthenes, you're thinking too Jewish. You're thinking like back in Israel. Now, back in Israel, it would have been a governmental matter because religion, government, in Jewish thinking, it's all one. And they say, Sosthenes, this is not going to work so well. Gallio is going to throw us out on our ear. And Sosthenes maybe, oh, no, that's not going to happen. Come on, you just watch this. And now it happened just like Sosthenes had been warned, and they turn against him. Maybe that happened. If I was writing a movie, that's the way I would write it. And people would blog about the movie and say, that's not biblical. They just made all they did. But we know that there's some other curious things that this is true. But we're in chapter 18, right? We're in chapter 8. The leader of the synagogue is being beat up. Well, just a dozen verses says that Paul was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks, and that's not the verse I wanted. Go to verse 8, I'm sorry. Of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. This is the same context. Maybe of Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, is saved, and now we've got Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. And they've already lost Crispus to conversion. He's become a believer now, and he's followed Paul. And now we have Sosthenes. Maybe I'm wrong again, but it appears he was beaten up, maybe because he was trying to go against Paul. And maybe, just maybe, again, I don't know, maybe Sosthenes is beaten up. Here's how my movie would go. Sosthenes is beaten up. He's lying on the ground. He tried to get Paul arrested by Gallio. It didn't work. His own people turned against him. There he is. And Paul comes up and says, brother, let me take you home and clean you up. And he takes him home and cleans him up. And he begins to talk to him. Corinthians, chapter 1 of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. Very interesting. Now, you say, we don't know if that's the same Sosthenes. Indeed, we don't. But we know it's the same Paul, it's the same Corinth, and something's happened here where you've got this Sosthenes. It's not mentioned anywhere else. And if you're going to find a Sosthenes in the Bible, there's the only one other Sosthenes you're going to find. Maybe something happened here that brought that about. Now, of course, those who would say it's too far-fetched for me, they would have their argument as well. They might say something like, if you mention Crispus, wouldn't you mention Sosthenes being saved? And I would think so, but I'm not Luke, so I don't know if he mentioned him being saved or not. But I do know that someday I'm going to heaven and I'm going to ask and see if I am right. And if I am wrong, then I am not going to mention it anymore. And with that, let's go on to verse 18. It says, Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. And in Caesarea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. Now, it's the port. And Corinth, he's going to head out. As he gets on a boat, it says he cut his hair. It goes on. I mean, that's all it says. He cut his hair for he's keeping a vow. Now, how many of you say, wait a minute. What do you mean he was keeping a vow and cutting his hair? What kind of deal was that? And so you begin, of course, to do a little research, and you begin to say, well, what's only one vow in all of the Old Testament? A Nazirite. And a Nazirite, of course, they're known for not cut their hair from up until the occasions was a temporary, it had a deadline on it. And during that time, you were not to cut your hair. And a man or a woman, by the way, could make this vow. But at the end of that vow, you shaved your head off. I've just finished my Nazirite vow. At the end of the vow, you shaved your head off, and it was displayed to everyone then, the obligations. And you can read about that in the book of Numbers as it goes along there. And so as we come to it, we want to assume, well, first of all, he must have been keeping a Nazirite vow. Well, let's just go with that for just a moment. He was keeping a Nazirite vow. And, of course, then you want to say, well, wait a minute. Wasn't he just taken to trial because he was taught about, he was charged with teaching about worship that's contrary to the law, and now he himself is obeying the law? If he was doing a Nazirite vow, then yes. In fact, there are a number of other occasions. We'll get to another one in Acts that has to do with the same haircutting kind of thing. And we saw it with Paul and Timothy, that there are times in which Paul chose to obey the law. And I think that there is an aspect of the law that if you were a Jewish person living in Israel or in the Jewish community, were things that did not go against the gospel, and you were to live by them. Now, Paul came along, and his real strong teaching was that the Gentiles don't need to do that. We're not going to carry our law over to the Gentiles, but I think you could even put forth the hypothesis, and that's all it is at this point as well. I think you could put forth the hypothesis that Paul lived according to the law all of his life. And he was the apostle among Gentiles. He didn't require the Gentiles to do that. And he taught that was not required. And I think even after the destruction of Jerusalem, there's no way to obey the law anyway. In fact, have you ever met one of your Jewish friends who was under a Nazirite vow? No, you haven't, and I know a lot of Jews. And none of them I've met are ever under a Nazirite vow. And do you know, if I ask them, well, how come you don't take a Nazirite vow every now and then? Or do any Jews take a Nazirite vow? They'd say, no, how could you take a Nazirite vow? And the reason would be because you were to cut your hair and take it to the temple. And at the temple, you were to bring it with some sacrifices and offer your hair as a sacrifice along with the requirements of Numbers, or the book of Numbers. And you were to offer that there. Maybe it was a Nazirite vow. Here's the problem with all of that, is that the Jewish leaders even of that day said you could take a Nazirite vow outside of Israel, but Josephus says that the rabbis taught you had to come into Israel and be 30 days under your vow in Israel before you ceased your vow. And they were teaching that you actually went to the temple to shave your head. So there are some things about this that say maybe it wasn't even a Nazirite vow. I mentioned tonight how I'm making several things up, which most pastors just don't have the dignity to tell you. But as you come here, do you know that you could probably put just as much weight on saying that Paul actually made a bargain with somebody on who was to win the Super Bowl, and he lost, and he had to shave his head? I don't know what kind of vow he was making. So there seems to be some problems with it. Why are you cutting your hair in Centuria? Now, let's go with, though, that maybe we just don't understand what the Jewish regulations were on how this could come about. Because there are those who say, no, when you came to the end of the time period, you had to shave your head no matter where you were. And then you had to get as quickly as you could to Jerusalem and offer that. Now, let's just go with that, though the evidence is not real strong. Let's go with that particular teaching and see what we get here as we continue on and look at verses 19 through 21. It says, Paul, having remained many days longer, this is in Centuria, he took leave of the brethren. Excuse me, I started at the wrong verse. I want to start at verse 19. So he's got his hair cut in verse 18. Verse 19, they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. He left Priscilla and Aquila there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews there, and when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he said, finally, every other synagogue I've been into, they chased me out and wanted me dead, and you all want me to stay. I will stay as long as you want. Right? No. They asked him to stay a longer time, but he did not consent. Taking leave of them, saying, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. Now, let's just consider one thing here, and that is, it seems strange that he received this warm welcome, but he didn't want to stay. So I got to go on. He certainly had some sort of agenda, didn't he? We don't know what the agenda was, but he needed to get out of there. And so he moved on, and he says, I'll come back if I can. Now, verse 21, again, the King James having a different underlying text, adds these important words. Says, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem. And then it says, if God wills, I'll be able to return back here. But the point is, I've got to get to Jerusalem. Well, if indeed it was a Nazirite vow, and indeed it is correct that you ended your vow on the date you said you were going to end your vow, no matter where it was, and you then got to Jerusalem as quickly as you could, it appears that he's saying, I'm going to get there. We don't know what feast this was, by the way, but we know he's still observing the feast, don't we? Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, who taught that the Gentiles didn't need to obey the law, is saying, I've got to get to Jerusalem for the feast, and I need to get there so much so that I can't even stay and preach the gospel here in Ephesus. I got to make it. And so as we continue down in verse 22, it says, when they had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and he went down to Antioch. Now, he went up where? Well, to the church, obviously, First Baptist Church of Caesarea. And he greeted them, and then he went down to Antioch. Not exactly. There is, when you look in the scripture, the phrase there, to go up, always refers to go where? Jerusalem. Still today, when a Jew moves to Israel, they say they're making aliyah, which means I'm moving up, I'm going up. And here he ascended, it says. So he went up. Well, in the Jewish way of thinking, if someone said, I went up and then I went down, there's nothing that would mean other than I went to Jerusalem and then I left. Because it didn't matter where you were coming from, which direction you were coming from. To go up was to go to Jerusalem, and to go down was to go away from Jerusalem. So I don't think that Luke would have written, he went up to the church at Caesarea and greeted them. That just wouldn't have fit with the words. That would have thrown everybody off. So he landed at Caesarea. He went up to Jerusalem. Now that makes perfect sense if you put back in what King James has in verse 21, and that is he's saying, I've got to get to Jerusalem. And so he landed at Caesarea and he went up to Jerusalem. And he greeted the church and he went down to Antioch. Now, here's where I'd like to say, Luke. You were so precise all the way through. And all you told us is he went up. And I want to know what he did with his hair. I want to know about this feast. I want to know the rest of the story here. And the truth is, I don't know the rest of the story. Did he go and offer his hair there? If he did, I can tell you that he also had to offer a blood sacrifice. That was part of it. You can read in the book of Numbers. And I know that is very disturbing, especially as you read, say, in the book of Hebrews, that I think Paul wrote, by the way. And, of course, certainly people disagree with me on that, too. But as you go into the book of Hebrews, and it says, you know, that in Hebrews chapter 12, for example, that there's no blood sacrifice that can offer anything. We've got the once for all sacrifice now. But once for all sacrifice, except for the ones we're going to have in the millennium, which I read about in Exodus chapter 40. So maybe we have this once for all sacrifice for sin and salvation, and Paul's not there making that kind of sacrifice, if he's even doing that at all. But I think you can lay out a proposal which is not so offensive to say Paul, who taught that you and I are not under the law, so much so that he was even offending all the Jews, was able to remain himself being obedient to the portions of the law, especially that didn't degrade the sacrifice of Jesus, and he's able to go and fulfill this vow. I don't know that that's true, but I think that you can put that together and not be offensive to basic Christian theology. Now, with this, he comes back to Antioch, and that brings him full circle, and he is back at the place where he began, where he started it all. And then many of your Bibles then at the beginning of verse 23, or somewhere right in there, they have a little heading that says Third Missionary Journey. I'm pretty convinced that Paul in his journal didn't say, today I have concluded my second missionary journey, can't wait for the third one to start. I think Paul would have looked at his one missionary life, and from his salvation on, he went, and just so happens that sometimes he went back and made a few circles, and as we analyze it, it comes out these 1, 2, 3 missionary journeys, but he was just living this one missionary life as it comes about. And I'm going to look at one more, verse 23. It says, and having spent, he left and passed successively through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Now, I have read sometimes, and you perhaps have too, someone will say, well, the Jewish church, if you will, was headquartered in Jerusalem, and the Gentile church was headquartered in Antioch. Understand what they're saying, that really is the church doesn't really have headquarters, does it? Because it's not an organization. And where's the headquarters for your body? Well, I guess the closest you could say is your head, right? And who is the head of the body? Christ. So our headquarters, if you will, are wherever Christ is. He happens to be at the right hand of God right now. And so as you think about headquarters, there's no headquarters for the church in Rome or Constantinople or Athens or Nashville or whatever it is you want to go. The headquarters are with Christ. He is the head of the church, and so he is, therefore, the headquarters. But we certainly see Antioch a lot, but not near as much, honestly, as we see Corinth. We know back in Ephesus or Thessalonica, these other places. So he stops in at Antioch. He goes then back to some of these places, Galatia and Phrygia in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, if you will. And he does this work of strengthening the disciples. A number of verses I've given you there if you want to do a little word study on that particular word, because if you look at the English word strengthening, there's these 6 or 7 different Greek words that underlie it. And what kind of strengthening is it? Well, the bottom line is it's not an empowering kind of strength, like I give you dynamite and that would strengthen you, if you're wanting to break down the wall or something. Not that kind of strength. It is not the one that makes you more able to do something than you were previously able to do it. It's not something that makes you more firm, as in, if you went to the gym, you might get strengthened in that manner. It's not the kind of word that rebuilds something, says, hey, this is getting a little wobbly, let's strengthen it. It's not that kind. It's not the government kind that you see in Ephesians 3:16. That's the word krateo, and we get all of our crassy words like democracy. And that is an organizational or governmental kind of strength that can come. It is not the building structural kind of strength. That word, oikodomeo, means, build it all the way up to the roof. It's not the strength for might, but it's this word, sterizo, which is the word that means to have a foundation. So what he was doing is going through Galatia region and Phrygia. These are both regions. And he's giving a stronger foundation to the apostle of apostles, and Paul's the apostle too. And I think one of the things the church has been weak on, the modern church has been weak on, is we've given lots of sticks and bricks, but not much foundation. And the big bad wolf comes and he huffs and he puffs and he blows the house down. And it happens over and over and over and over and over again to a body of believers maybe, but certainly to individual believers. And how many examples does Paul give of this, of being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine and all these kind of things? Have a foundation. And this is one of the reasons I'm just so set on teaching things like, doesn't verse 13 teach that there must be a change in dispensations? Because if you don't get that foundational element, some of the other things are not going to make sense at all. When we pick up next week, we'll see back in Ephesus, there's Aquila and Priscilla who meet a guy whose name is accurate in the Word. And he's powerful in the Word. The problem is that he's standing on the wrong foundation. And so they're going to teach him a more excellent way, and he's going to be then a great servant of the church. So great from Apollos, someone who is able to stand and give a defense of their faith. Where we will pick up next week. I hope you have a good foundation, and if the big bad wolf comes to your house, that he does not blow it down. With that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you.